right, it's officially October. I don't want to hear anyone complaining. It's officially Halloween. No questions, no debate. We are in October. Fall is in the air. You cannot deny it any longer. I'm putting a new decoration. Texturally, I hate that thing. I hate touching it, but we're making the bookshelf spooky because, again, as I mentioned, it's Halloween. And I have the perfect book to start off this wonderful Halloween season with. Hello, welcome back. It is a new day, a new sleigh, and a new video where I have something to say. And today I would like to talk to you about this book that I bought. I actually have the receipt from when I bought it, so let me tell you. So just in case you were worried about your book buying habits and thinking to yourself, hey, maybe I have it really bad and I shouldn't be buying books, let me tell you, I bought this book, apparently according to the receipt that's in the book, which apparently I haven't opened since this date, which is fun to know. I bought this book on... This is actually kind of embarrassing because according to this receipt, I bought it exactly from today, 3 years ago. That's so bad. And you know, as much as that says about me and my book buying habits, it also says that even back then, I had good taste in books because the book that I bought that fateful day was The Taking of Jake Livingston by Ryan Douglas. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I don't read a lot of like horror or scary books, and that's just because I really don't have the stomach for it. I don't even like watching like horror movies. First of all, I think the reason that I picked up this book originally was because of the cover, and I did briefly read the summary, but I will tell you, I did not remember what this book was about. So when I was planning the books I wanted to read for this month, I was like, well, I should probably read books that are like kind of scary, kind of spooky, in theme with October. And I was like, oh, surely a book about ghosts will fit this theme. And I didn't read the summary. I learned nothing about what this book was about before I read it, and oh my god, sometimes it's a good idea to know what a book is about before you pick it up. Frequently I do this to myself where I don't actually look up the summary and I'm just like, oh yeah, let me read this book. And it's really a 50-50 of what you'll get. And truly, I could not have expected what I was going to get when I picked up this book until I read it, and it The Taking of Jake Livingston is a story about Jake Livingston, our main character, and he is a medium. That means that he can see ghosts. But he's a little different, and the way that his powers kind of work in this world is very different compared to a lot of the other like stories, whatever TV shows, movies I've watched / read. Because honestly, when I was going into this book, I thought I was gonna get Paranorman. Like that was the vibe I was getting. No, God no. Not even close. So he sees ghosts, but he sees them as they are reliving constantly the day that they died, rather the exact moment that they died. And they're stuck in these loops where they're constantly having to go through that until they fade away into the nether. I don't know. So obviously, as a teenage medium, he's not too popular. On top of the fact that he goes to a school where they're racist, and he's also gay. So he doesn't have a lot going for him socially, which is kind of sad. So in this story, he is being haunted by a ghost. This ghost is not like any of the others that he's experienced in his lifetime. This one has a vengeance. We're talking past poltergeist level vengeance. This is like The Conjuring. I haven't even watched that movie because I'm actually afraid of it, but I know that that's serious. This ghost is actually rather close to home. This is the ghost of Sawyer Doon, and Sawyer was a teenager living in relatively the same area as Jake when he died. One fateful day, Sawyer walked into his high school and pew-pewed the building, unaliving 6 of his fellow classmates before taking his own life. And now he is back with a vengeance, and he has latched onto Jake for seemingly no reason, except to cause him havoc and heartbreak. So the story follows Jake as he tries to figure out why Sawyer is here and find a way to banish him permanently. Because Sawyer is not only causing problems for Jake, but he is somehow taking a semi-corporeal form and unaliving more people from beyond the grave. So from that summary, I'm going to transition into the trigger warning for today's video. So right now, I'm going to let you know that this book and this review do talk about topics such as SA, violence, specifically the pew-pew violence, as well as general situations of abuse, homophobia, and racism. If you are sensitive to any of those topics, please feel free to click off this video. And by all means, you don't have to check out this book. This is definitely for a very specific audience, and you will need a strong stomach to get through it. By all means, do whatever it takes to make you feel comfortable. So with that out of the way, let's get into the rest of the video. Before I even get started, I will say that when I finished this book, because it's a pretty fast read, the audiobook was about 8 hours. It's only like 200 something pages. Let me double check. Yeah, it's only 240 pages. This is a very, very quick read. I have very few instances where I finish a book and I truly just don't know what to do with myself. And I feel very like almost numbed, where I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say, think, do. I actually finished this book a few weeks ago, and even in that time, like approaching this video, I was like, I don't even know what intellectually I could say about it. I do have notes and I do have something semi-intellectual to say, so please stick around for that. But this is definitely a book that, I don't know how to say this in a nice way, but it takes something from you. I continued reading for the sake of finishing a book. I really hate to DNF a book, and I've only done it once this whole year, but it was just a book where like almost dragged me through it. And again, not because it was boring and not because I didn't enjoy reading it, but just because it was just like narrative wise, it like beats you, almost like kicks you while you're down with like just how heavy everything hits. And again, because I'm not like a horror kind of person, I don't typically like reading horror, it was definitely dragging me along. Another big part, and I will mildly go into some of the dislikes I have about this book now, I was very, very confused about some of the world building for this book, and that being specifically Jake's powers and this like paranormal aspect to the story. Part of it is my fault, because when I was reading the book, again, I thought I was gonna get like Paranorman. This is supposed to be for young adult. I thought I was gonna get like a lighthearted kind of like medium ghost story. So when it started getting like serious, I was like, oh no, I haven't been paying hard enough attention up till this point, and now I'm lost. And the part where I was like, okay, this is kind of serious is, I forget which chapter it is, but it's honestly pretty early on. And this is why I'm saying like you need to know what kind of book this is before you get into it, because otherwise it's gonna be bad. Imagine me like just going through, I'm listening to my audiobook, I'm like washing my dishes, doing my thing, right? And then all of a sudden I'm in Jake's perspective and he's like in class, everything's fine, everything's going good. And then he starts hearing shots in school and he's having to, and I was like, what? In this book, they did a drill. They gave them a 4D experience simulation. And personally, that's vile. And I say that that's vile because when I was in high school, we did something similar. That experience for me personally actually still gives me nightmares. It did not have sound, but there was a point like when I was about to graduate where we did a drill. It was to the point where we had to practice an evacuation and practice how you are supposed to walk out of the building to make sure that the police don't think you are the perpetrator. So imagine me like 17 years old. I'm in physics. I don't even have my phone because I got grounded. And then all of a sudden I have to know how to make myself seem like not a target. Anyway, reading that like completely opened up all my years of trauma having to go through these same drills. So thank you. F you. But anyway, up until that point, I was like casually reading, and then all of a sudden I was like, oh God, I gotta be paying attention. And then by that point, I didn't understand, and then I would go back and reread and I still didn't understand, because at first like the foundation, they're like, okay, the ghosts he's seeing are stuck in these loops, like they don't interact with him, but then there are ghosts that interact with him and they freak him out and they scare him, and they're like ghouls and poltergeists and stuff, and I'm like, okay, but do they actually hurt you? I'm confused. So the first problem I had was I didn't know realistically like how much these ghosts could interact with Jake and with other people that can't see them. So when Sawyer is introduced, it didn't immediately trigger in my mind that he's supposed to be an anomaly and that he's not supposed to have that power set. And then also with Sawyer, he can interact with people in the real world, and that's never really explained. They go into like, oh, it's because he's such like a vengeful spirit and he's holding on to so much anger and aggression that he can reach over. But I'm like, okay, but how? Just in like the basic understanding that most people have with ghosts, it's like, okay, well, they can manipulate the things around you, but causing you direct harm, I don't think that's very common for ghosts. Like, there's possession, for sure. They can, like, throw stuff at you, I guess. But he's, like, full-on committing, like, he's unaliving people. So I'm like, how are you doing that, actually? And they also didn't explain how he got that much power. They said it was that he was feeding off of his victims. But I'm like, how did he do that? The way I picture it is, like, these ghosts are, like, they're trains on a track. But I'm like, how did Sawyer jump the track? I just don't know. And then also at some point, Jake is able to, like, shoot ectoplasm from his hands. Because he does that as, like, an astral projection. So I'm like, is any of that able to work while he's in his normal body? What are the properties of this ectoplasm? It was just, like, very confusing. And I did see some Goodreads reviews before I made my script for this video. And some people were saying that, like, his abilities and his power set while he's in this, like, astral realm do feel a lot of, like, Deus Ex Machina type powers, where, like, he needed to fight Sawyer, but it's like, how do you fight a ghost? So they turned him into Danny Phantom for those parts. Oh my god, he's essentially Danny Phantom. Oh, he's Danny Phantom. See, you just have to get, like, a good idea of what you're dealing with, and then it makes sense. Okay, so that was hard to follow initially. And then structurally, it was also kind of hard to follow because we're going back and forth between Jake and Sawyer's perspective. I liked at the beginning because you didn't initially know who Sawyer was. And then it gets revealed that he's A, dead already, and B, was the person that, you know, did the thing at his school. That was a good reveal, but then it was a little confusing because, you know, Sawyer's perspective, his, like, past experiences, presumably leading up to the day that he decides to do this, is fine. But then when we're in Jake's present perspective, it feels like it takes a really long time for him to know that Sawyer is the person that's haunting him. So up till that point, it's kind of confusing why we're getting his perspective. And I feel like Sawyer's chapters are very, like, solid. Like, character-wise, it's unsettling, the things he's going through. Again, I say that lightly. He is still a school, you know. But I think it's also easier to read because it's grounded in reality. We don't have to focus on the ghosts when we're in his perspective. When we're in Jake's perspective, first of all, it takes him a really long time to figure out what is going on. The first part is just, like, a lot of, like, horror. It's just him experiencing ghosts and all this creepy, crazy stuff. And it takes a while for him to really get into, like, his plot of, like, okay, there is a danger. I need to save everyone. Yada, yada, yada. I wasn't really keeping pace with the plot until, honestly, like, halfway through the story. Halfway through the story, like, I was locked in. But it takes a while to get locked in. I will say that the horror is horrifying. So I have Goodreads, as some of you may know. I recently started, like, actually actively updating my progress as I'm going through the book. And the first book that I did this for was The Taking of Jake Livingston. So you can see, like, when I started and all these, like, notes, what percentage I was at. I like it so much better than the way that I was using to keep track of all my thoughts. One of my favorite lines from the book is, like, it's the first, like, little note that I wrote. They describe a ghost's his head, and it's described as a biscuit tin popped and spiraling, and it was so disgusting, but it was so good. I was like, I know you ate with that. Although it was just very unfortunate because I had one of the little, like, Pillsbury cinnamon rolls. I still have it in my fridge because after reading that, I couldn't. There's a lot of, like, body horror as well as, like, bug horror, which I threw up. I was so disgusted, but it was written very well. And I say that as someone that is not 100% familiar with the genre, but even from an outside perspective, I can recognize that it was written very well. But the main thing I wanted to focus on with this review was something that I saw in a lot of people's reviews of this book, and that is Sawyer. People were especially mad because they thought that this book was trying to make you sympathize for him or make him seem redeemable, or that you're supposed to forgive him almost for what he's done. The one thing that I was, like, pretty solid in my analysis of this read surrounded this specific topic. I first want to say that I don't think that as the reader, we're supposed to forgive Sawyer. I don't think he's supposed to be redeemable as a character. And most importantly, I don't think that narrative-wise throughout the book that he's actually portrayed as a redeemable character. So in Sawyer's chapters, in his perspective, because he's writing in a diary, we find out that leading up to this event, he was first hospitalized after trying to unalive himself. He was then taken out of this hospital by his mother because he made the assumption that she felt embarrassed to have a son in a mental hospital. Then from there, we can see that he's being neglected by his family, and his mom eventually kind of sticks him with one of his uncles, who on the day of this incident tries to SA Sawyer. And then when Sawyer pulls out on him, his mom comes home and sees Sawyer. Uncle Rod tells Sawyer's mom that he just pulled this weapon on him. Sawyer, with the item still in his hands, uses it against Uncle Rod, and simultaneously his own mother takes up her item and injures Sawyer. It is after this that Sawyer runs to the school and does what he did. So people didn't necessarily like that this was included in the story because they thought that including all of this tragic backstory was supposed to make us feel bad for him and quote unquote understand why he did what he did. To which that I say, listen, if you hear about all the horrible things someone has gone through and you feel bad for them, congratulations. You are a human being that has experienced empathy. That's a normal human response. From my perspective, the writer does this for a very explicit reason. A, to almost challenge you on how far you're willing to go, how much empathy and sympathy you can extend to a human being. And maybe controversially, I don't think you're necessarily supposed to forgive him for what he's done. I don't think that reading all this horrible things that has happened to him makes him redeemable. I think that we read from Sawyer's perspective, that we get this build up to this day so that we can see how him and Jake are the same person. Jake and Sawyer are character foils. Character foils are essentially like mirrors of each other. They share a lot of the same traits. Typically, it's like one specific thing that differentiates them so that you can see the two different paths this one character can take. Very famous character foils include Katara and Azula from Avatar: The Last Airbender. They were both daughters, child prodigies, seemingly had no parents, specifically like without a mother figure. The difference between those characters is that Katara was raised in an environment that had a lot of love and family, and Azula was not, which is why their characters were so different. It's the exact same thing with Jake and Sawyer. Jake is an outcast and seemingly does not have a lot of friends. Same as Sawyer. Jake is alienated from his family, same as Sawyer. Jake does have a brother, but he kind of like bullies him and doesn't really like associate with him. And his mother is absent, and as we learn later on in the story, Jake and his mom don't have necessarily the best relationship because Jake blames her for allowing, quote unquote, allowing him to be abused by their father. In school, Jake experiences extreme racism and homophobia, and while Sawyer was in school, he experienced a lot of homophobia. So just generally, they both experienced heavy bullying while they were in school. Both Jake and Sawyer do have like these odd traits, things that kind of separate them from the rest of society. For Jake, it's that he can obviously see ghosts. And for Sawyer, he has a morbid curiosity with death and dying. And controversially, Jake has violent tendencies, and I say that because I don't necessarily think that he would do this to anyone, but there is a point in the story where he takes a pencil and puts it through the hand of this guy that has been bullying him throughout the entire story, something that he gets suspended for, and they threaten to arrest him for. And we obviously know what Sawyer did, so. And then Jake and Sawyer both try reaching out for help, but cannot receive it for different reasons. Sawyer wanted to stay in the hospital at the very beginning of the story when we find out that he tried to unalive himself. He wanted to stay and receive treatment, but his mom was the one that took him out of it. And with Jake, he tried reaching out to his brother to explain all the bad things that has been happening to him, specifically with the ghosts, but his brother dismisses him. Jake's arc follows very closely to Sawyer's, where we see for both of them, they're starting already in a bad situation, and we see how it progresses and things build onto each other. Stressors, bullying, all this horrible things keep happening to both of them, and we know how it ends for Sawyer, but for Jake, it's still up in the air. Now, what is the thing that makes Jake and Sawyer different? Ultimately, Jake had more support than Sawyer did. Sawyer was very heavily isolated from the rest of his family, and personally, I think it's also a cultural difference. As a person of color myself, I find that my familial ties are a lot stronger to my white counterparts. And that's not to say for everyone, but just generally a lot of my white friends or just people that I've talked to don't have like these big families. And I even argue they don't keep in close contact with their extended family. It was just very communal the way that I was raised. So I knew that I had a lot of people supporting me no matter what. So I think that when you have a smaller family, especially if you're like the youngest or you don't have a lot of siblings, it can feel very isolating. Sawyer had just his sister, his mom, and his uncle. That's only 3 people, which is hard for me to picture because I grew up with all 13 of my cousins, closely grew up with 13 cousins. So I can't even imagine how isolating that must be, especially to have like your core people not really be helping you and not know how to help you. Throughout the book, from the beginning, Jake and Sawyer seem to be following similar paths. We see Jake kind of follow the same steps that Sawyer did. And at first it's really hard to picture because we know what happened to Sawyer. We know what he's done. So it's hard for us to see our protagonist, the person we're supposed to root for, follow the same footsteps as the villain of the story. The moment when Jake takes the pencil and puts it through that dude's hand, I was terrified. Even to a point, I thought that Sawyer had already possessed him and that was the reason why he'd done it. It was just so hard to picture that that was something that he could do and that was something that he had in him. Granted, it was provoked and it was after someone literally called him a slave and was not reprimanded for it. So I get it. But that jump in his character, that moment was when I like really clicked in my mind. I knew that him and Sawyer are the same person. The most important part of this story, he confronts his mom about his dad abusing him for being gay and that she didn't do anything to stop it. His own brother isn't really there to support him and he runs away from home. Through the mist, through the ghostly veil, come all his ancestors to rally him and support him to fight off Sawyer. And in this moment, it was really important for his character because he asks if when he dies, will he be able to be in that same place as them, even though he's gay. I almost cried. I was literally like driving on my way to work. I was crying. It was really bad. And it was just a beautiful moment because his ancestors were like, that's what you're worried about? You gotta fight this ghost from beyond the grave? And for them, it's not even a question. It's not even a concern. So this is the first time that to himself, he's admitted that he is gay, like said the words out loud. And simultaneously, the first time that he's been without question accepted for it by his own family members. So that moment, feeling that relief and acceptance puts Jake back on the right path. Now for Sawyer, he never got that opportunity. His mother shot him. In that moment, it was one of the very, very few people in his corner, one of the few people that could support him in that time, turned her back on him. And it was awful. I think the purpose, the explicit purpose of having these two characters, having them be foils of each other, is so that we recognize what the steps are on this downward spiral and how to stop it. Because issues of mental health, bullying, these are all instances that can lead to these kinds of events. And I think that it's important to recognize them. I mean, simultaneously understanding that there are so many factors and so many other ways that we can prevent this, i.e. gun control. But there are other ways that we can stop it at the source, and that being just providing more support to kids in schools. And I am definitely like the kind of person that when these things happen and when we hear about it on the news, I always get so frustrated and angry when it's always just written off as, oh, they had mental health issues or something like that. And we neglect to realize that this person has genuinely done something bad and that we can recognize the bad things that someone has gone through and the traumas and the horrible experiences and still understand that they should be punished for these actions and that what they did is still horrible and this is not in any way a rationale for what happens. I'm going to put that out there now. I understand that. This is a very multifaceted issue. An issue that I truly can only break the surface of in this kind of video. But this book is a great starting point to talk about this kind of conversation, and specifically what we can do to help support children, our family members, people that are going through these very same issues. Because the things that Sawyer was experiencing, his behaviors leading up to that point, at literally any part of that timeline, it could have been stopped. It could have been different if he had just gotten support, the proper treatment that he needed. God forbid if people decided, hey, this person that has obviously had issues probably shouldn't have a weapon. I don't know, maybe these things could have been avoided. Ultimately, I think that's what this story is trying to tell us, because it's so easy to recognize what could have been different once the story is already over. For Sawyer, his life is already over. He's already done. We can look back and see where we went wrong. We have to do that for people that are still here, for the people that we can still save. Sawyer as a character is someone that the author forces us to see as a whole person. Again, not forcing us to forgive him, to redeem him and his actions, but to see him as someone outside of this thing that he did, this horrible, horrible thing, but also understand what led up to it. It really, really tests the limits of how far you can go for a character and how much sympathy you can give to someone. But ultimately, I don't think he's supposed to be a character that you're supposed to forgive, because in the end of the story, he goes to hell. He literally goes to hell. He also takes possession of Jake's body, and when he does, he unalives Uncle Rod. And that moment, I think, is like another point where you really have to question yourself as a reader, your own morals and values, because unaliving is wrong. Uncle Rod tried to SA his own nephew. I don't know. I will not say what side I am on. However, I get it. Eat predators is all I'm going to say. But at the end of the story, he's still a monster. He is still the villain of our story, and he's still paying for all the horrible things that he's done, both in his life and in his afterlife. We understand the things he's gone through and why they're bad and why they are incredibly traumatic, but do we necessarily feel bad for him to the point where we understand why he did what he did? No, because there's nothing that excuses that, nothing that explains that, nothing. Literally nothing. Ultimately, you're just supposed to recognize and understand what led up to that point and how we could have stopped it and how we can stop it in the people that are still here. Because for Jake, after this point, after he successfully banishes Sawyer to hell, he makes amends with his family. His mother apologizes for what he's gone through and the abuse that he endured from his father. Jake admits to his brother that he's gay, and his own brother accepts him, and he says like, hey, I've known this whole time. There's no problem. You're okay. And it's only after this point, once he's like talking to his family, that he's able to really recognize and understand the things that he wasn't able to see before. He suddenly remembers that when his father was abusing him, his brother was the person that defended him. His brother immediately jumped in and pushed his father off him. He suddenly recognizes that, hey, I was enduring this, but I remember hearing my mom yelling and screaming and them having fights. She must have endured the same exact thing. And it's only after this point that he's really able to see that even though he's had these horrible experiences, and even though he hasn't necessarily been on the same page with his family, that they care for him, that they love him, and most importantly, that they will support him no matter what. Because oftentimes when you're going through like a mental health struggle or a crisis, it's hard to really see things for what they are and to recognize when people are on your side, especially when you experience such mass rejection in school or from your peers. It's really hard to see the truth that there are people that care for you, that there are people that love you. It's really, really hard to think positively when it feels like everything around you is just crumbling. So I really liked that was included at the end, but because we can see the shift in his character and the shift in his mentality. And now he knows that he does have support systems. And when the story finishes out, he has his brother, he has his mom, he has new friends, and he has a boyfriend. Yep, I didn't mention that. he does have a boyfriend when this story finishes out, and it's beautiful. Overall, this story is very complex, very complicated, and it does elicit a lot of complicated feelings. I was constantly at odds with myself about what position I wanted to take with this video, like what I really wanted to say. It really made me question my own values and morals while I was reading this book. But this book does it in a way that is so like brutal, blunt, and unapologetic about all of its messaging and what it is forcing you to think. Almost to a point where I don't even want to give this book a rating because I'm like, I don't even know how I feel. Like truly, I still experience the numbness. See, because obviously world building wise, there were some things I didn't like. There was a whole plot point where Sawyer, as a ghost, uploaded an S-tape from Jake's brother to TikTok. That one really took me out. I was like, what are you talking about? I think tentatively I'm gonna give this a 3 out of 5. I want to be Switzerland and not give a rating at all, but I do really enjoy this whole thing that I went through with Sawyer and Jake and how they mirror each other. Plot wise, it could use some help. I think this book definitely could have afforded to be a little bit longer. There are some books that I'm reading right now that are so incredibly long. Donate some of your runtime to this book, please. It could have used it, just a tap. But despite giving it a 3 out of 5, I do still think that this is a book that people should read, should think about, be prepared to point and stare at yourself in the mirror when asking yourself these kinds of questions. The vibes are Halloween, but if they were morally gray and having to constantly stare at myself in the mirror and question my own morals and values as a human being and how much I'm willing to empathize and sympathize for other people, that's a Halloween vibe. That's a spooky vibe. No? Anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope I was kind of coherent and making sense. This is a book that I'm still like, I don't know if I got it. I'm pretty solid in my Sawyer analysis, but otherwise I'm like, did I read this book? Did I get it? Be sure to check out The Taking of Jake Livingston. I highly recommend using the audiobook because, you know, reading through the physical book is one thing, but the voice acting in the audiobook is top tier. I almost threw up with the kind of like vocal prowess that this dude has. Sawyer sounds horrifying, truly giving Tate from season 1 American Horror Story, aka Murder House. Like, you just cannot get that from only reading the book and making up the characters' voices in your head. You need the audiobook. Get a library card, download Libby, get the audiobook. It's worth it. I started off like literally insane out of my mind because I had my AirPods and I did like the noise canceling and I was just staring off into the distance reading it, and there's a point where there's like and it's crazy. I could throw up just thinking about it. I don't know if the author really keeps up on social media. I checked out his Instagram, but it didn't seem like super active. This is definitely a book that I'm like, this needs to get adapted into some kind of movie or something, because I think I just need to see it. Like, I kind of see it here, but I need to see it over here, if you know what I mean. But you can also follow me on all my social media at Listen to Kristen on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter. As I mentioned, I'm also keeping up on like Goodreads, so if you want to check that out, that's also a possibility. Man, I'm so excited for Halloween, and specifically pumpkins. I love everything pumpkin. I just tried a pumpkin butter latte, something like that. It was really good. It's honestly not the drink I'm drinking right now, but it was a drink that I had. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you were able to stomach everything that I went through. It is very heavy. I'm gonna need to watch some Dancing Fruit after this, to say the least. Enjoy Halloween. Make it spooky. Thank you.